Hello and welcome back to Showdown. Good to have you with us. We're joined now in the studio from the Centre for Independent Studies at the far end of the panel. Andrew Baker, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
From the Australian Financial Review, John Keogh, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
And Member for Chifley, Ed Husic, good to see you.
Good seeing you too.
Let me start with you before we get to some of the wider issues. Your learned mentor, Kevin Rudd, has come out and said that he supports gay marriage now. He's backflipped on that. So it's not just the ETS, obviously, that he's of a mind to flip-flopping on now gay marriage as well.
It's always great being here, Peter. I say it, I never get bored of saying that.
But he's moved around on this issue now.
No, well, he actually, it's...
Has he moved in the right direction?
Knowing what he's been going, or he's been thinking about this issue since National Conference of 2011, when you'll recall we took two decisions. One is to alter our platform, and the second was to allow MPs to vote according to conscience in the upcoming vote during the course of 2012. So he's been thinking through that over that period of time, and that's the position that he's arrived
So
at.
you thought he'd wait till roughly 90 days before the election and then just bang, drop it out there?
No, convenient ignoring of the facts there, Peter, that we've got a vote coming up. So after Parliament resolved not to change the Marriage Act last year, the Greens decided to take that on board and put it to another vote. And so Adam Bance moved another resolution to try and do exactly what he did about 12 months ago. And that vote comes up on the 6th of June. So you'll see that there are a number of MPs that have been making their positions known in relation to the vote as it's coming up. There have been some Liberals that have said that they'll change their position.
Dwyer, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So, and Kevin's taken his position and announced it
So
today.
what's your view? Are you pro or anti-gay marriage?
From a personal perspective, and I've said this within the electorate as well, I'm not opposed to it, but I have, in terms of the soundings I've taken from the electorate itself, like I can pretty much detect that there's not a mood for change or altering the Marriage Act. So I have a pretty firm view that I don't think Parliament, and I've said this to advocates on both sides of the fence, I don't think on an issue as you know, so deeply held views on this, as strongly as they are held, I don't think it should be something that Parliament necessarily says, well, we're going to impose our social views, and I don't feel
even
comfortable.
As a conscience vote?
Well, I don't feel comfortable as an MP taking my view of not really being personally opposed to it and telling people that that's what they should accept in my area.
So what do you want to see happen?
Well, ultimately, I actually think I'm tired of this going through Parliament in the way that it has, where we just have these votes. We had one last year, we've got one coming up. You've got one side of politics that's saying, notably the Conservatives, are saying, well, we're not going to allow people to have a vote on it. I actually think that it should ultimately be taken as a plebiscite or a referendum to guide the next Parliament about what it does.
Just a completely popular vote on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there are views that say... there are people that are saying...
their responsibility.
No, it's not actually, because, and the reason I come back to the point that I feel strongly on the notion that in terms of my views with respect to what people feel on the ground in my area, that, you know, if there are people who say that the Marriage Act shouldn't be changed and they've got the numbers, well, we'll find out. If there are people that say... who are pro-marriage equality and think that the numbers are there to do it, get it done, get community support for this, instead of having a basically a race to convince as many MPs on what should be done to change the social position.
That's what's called representative democracy. I mean, John and Andrew, what do you think of Ed's idea that parliamentarians shouldn't be making decisions and it should just be done to the people as a citizen-initiated referendum?
Well, I always like to see politicians decide at the end of the day, because they're the elected officials who we elect to represent us in the Parliament. I mean, there's been similar suggestions over we should hand out superannuation out of the politicians' hands and let some unelected
John
kind of
thinks
official...
you're crazy.
But I think for an MP like Ed, he's in a difficult position, is he? Because
don't backtrack just because you're sitting next to him.
Electorate,
you think he's nuts on this
His electorate, Ed was telling me this before, is 28% Catholic. He's not personally opposed to it, so I can understand why someone like him wants to maybe hand it to someone else's responsibility. But at the end of the day...
Because he's worried about votes.
And absolutely, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, though, politicians, through a conscience vote in Parliament, need to stand up there and decide one way or the other on it.
For what it's worth, I actually agree with you, Ed, after taking the mickey out of you. On this particular issue, I think there's some benefits to having a plebiscite. So I actually think you're wrong, John. What do you think, Andrew?
I think...
Have a good go. He's sort of whacked me with 4x4. He's let this guy go.
I don't like to see politicians abrogate responsibility. I think they should take a stand and vote how they...
But is it abrogating responsibility for the politicians to turn around and give the voters an empowerment? I mean, it depends on the issue, of course, but on something as clearly conscience vote based as this, is it really abrogating responsibility as opposed to empowering the electorate on what is a divisive issue?
No, I don't think so. I think this is something that politicians can take a stand on, and they should let the electorate choose which way they want to go at the federal election rather than fobbing it off later.
Okay, so can I so taking on board that point, and I get where you're coming from. We've got one side of politics, though, that says, regardless of what you think personally, this is the coalition, we're not letting individual MPs decide.
Well, no, there's a good reason for that. Look, I'm pro-gay marriage, as you know, but I can see Tony Abbott's point on this for the current Parliament. I think, however, he should release his MPs and go to the next election saying that there'll be a conscience vote in the next election. The reason he's doing it with a rigid party vote now, in fairness to him, is that he says this was a party position that we took to the last election, so we're going to stick with it for this term of Parliament. What frustrates me is he's now taking the same thing to the next election because he has a personal view that he doesn't want to go to a conscience vote.
That's my point, that on either side of the debate, you've got people who've got these personal views, and I think ultimately, in terms of the issue of marriage, and there's I actually recently door-knocked a same-sex couple who were very uptight with me about the fact that I had not voted for same-sex marriage last time. But we'd actually had a fairly...
Well, they're hardly going to be able to vote for your alternative candidate. She's part of the hard right in the Liberal Party.
But I was going to make the point that while we were sitting there talking, had friends of theirs too, another same-sex couple, who were having arguments with them too about saying, well, marriage is actually recognised as a religious institution. So I'm not saying that one conversation represents a broader thing, but the fact of the matter is, you need to be able to get community decision on this where it's so deeply held.
John and Andrew, what do you reckon about what the consensus needs to be? Because it strikes me that the people that are against gay marriage, often for religious reasons, are incredibly passionate about it in a greater number than the smaller number of people that are incredibly passionate about being for gay marriage, albeit with a larger majority, according to opinion polls, who are also in favour of gay marriage, like myself, for example, but probably not that passionate about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, look, you wouldn't want to see it get to a situation where it got over the line because maybe 50% plus one of the population supported it. I think you'd need an overwhelming majority. That's what happened under Ed's model. You'd need an overwhelming majority, say, let's throw a ballpark figure up there, maybe 60% plus, because you'd want strong support for something as big as this and controversial as this to get through to the community, to have it in lockstep for the next however many years. I mean, once it's in, isn't it? So I think we would need really strong community support for it if it's going to eventuate.
Andrew?
Well, I think this poses a particularly significant problem for an Abbott government because most of his base would be hostile to the idea of gay marriage. So if he opens up to a conscience vote, he would essentially split his own party.
So why doesn't Tony Abbott allow a conscience vote now while it's not under his watch? I find it peculiar that he might allow one when he's presumably going to be the next Prime Minister, and then this is a problem for him politically because we know his views, we know he's a devout Christian, he's opposed to it. Wouldn't it be easier for him to say, OK, we'll go to this before this election, we'll have a conscience vote on it, and then see what the outcome is, and he can always point back to that if it doesn't get up and say, well, I gave people the opportunity, a conscience vote, it wasn't voted for, yes, and we're not going to continue with it in the next Parliament.
Keep the tweets and emails coming so we know what you think. One of our Twitter followers has said, PVO is pro-gay marriage. I thought he was straight. Guess what? Kevin Rudd's straight, and he's pro-gay marriage. You don't have to be gay to be pro-gay marriage. What a ridiculous tweet. But another tweet that came in, Ed Husic, asked the question of are you copping out on this because you are Muslim and you don't want to upset the Muslim community by being pro-gay marriage?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. And look, I've had those discussions with people across faiths, be they Muslim or Catholic, Anglican, and there are a range of people in my area that are of the view that they want the Marriage Act to stay the same. And I guess I've come back to the point I've said earlier, that I don't think it's right that my own personal views, be the ones that I say, well, this is what should apply in an electorate where there are a lot of people that say differently. So
but that's the case. That's the same on every issue. I mean, that's the same on every issue, and it may not be a 50-50 in your electorate traditionally, even on the partisan divide, although I suspect it's going to get a lot closer to that after the next election. But the reality is that that's the case on most issues. Whether it's gay marriage, GST introduction, Labor versus Liberal. I mean, you've always got sort of large divides and large chunks of the population that don't agree with what you do. You still make a stand on them, though, as the elected MP.
In my head, Peter, on this issue, I divide between economic or environment, because I've sort of had people say as well, well, we didn't go to a referendum on the carbon tax. But there are differences between economic and environmental issues, and ones where there are deep issues of faith and social views about the nature of or the makeup of society, and there are people that feel strongly on both sides of the debate in terms of the way that marriage
Kevin Rudd playing games on this, do you think, or do you think this is just a heartfelt change of opinion?
I think he's been going on this matter for the course of a number of, well, it's nearly 2 years now, since the national conference, and been going through it. And it's difficult for him as a former Prime Minister, because if he'd said no change, then it wouldn't be an issue. But the fact that he's overturn a position that he's held, and he's a former Prime Minister, obviously makes
it a bigger issue.
Exactly.
That said, let's move on to much bigger issues, and that's the economy now. Andrew Baker, let me start with you. You're a small government man. Ed here's part of a government that has just been going wildly out of control for years now. You must have a real issue with the job they've done.
They've done not a very good job. We've had
a terrible job. You think that his government has done a terrible job, correct?
We've seen massive excessive spending throughout for many years, declining revenue, and then this whole process is unsustainable. And what
have they got wrong in particular?
Well, I think they increased pensions by a bit too much is what I have in mind, and among other things, I suppose.
John, do you agree with that, or are you with Ed on this stuff?
Oh, look, I think they've had some...
Can you just tell the way he's couching all these? Are you with Ed or are you against Ed in this whole program? Is this the way you're going to be setting it up for the whole thing?
Well, I'm going to give you a handshake and a punch at the same time. Look, I think Labor has had some really good big picture policy ideas, such as a mining tax, such as a price on carbon. But their execution...
You're waiting for the but.
Their execution of policy has been shambolic. They haven't been able to implement it properly. I mean, the mining tax, which I think most people now acknowledge, even including in the big business community outside of the resources sector, was probably a good idea, but they've absolutely bungled it. Onto the budget, I think the budget isn't a real problem. There's massive structural deficits. We've wasted the commodities boom. It's not just your side of politics that did it. The last 3 or so years of the Howard government did it as well.
But they're a lot worse, surely. I mean, at the end of the day, the Howard government had no debt. They'd paid off Labor's debt. They'd put $60 billion in the future fund, and they'd delivered 10 out of 12 surpluses. I mean, there's no comparison, even though they may have had structural deficits.
I think the first 7 or 8 years of the Howard government were probably fairly economically responsible. The last term of government, I think they let themselves slip. But we need to get the budget back under control. It's not because debt or deficits are bad, they're not. But when Australia has gone through a big terms of trade boom, we've got reasonably low unemployment. These are the times in the economy when we should be balancing the budget. Because if you can't balance it now, when can you?
Andrew, when Tony Abbott wins, because let's be honest, he's going to win in a landslide. When Tony Abbott wins, are you going to be holding from the right, I guess, on a small government sense, him to account every bit as much as the CIS has done to Labor with their profligate large-scale government spending?
Well, absolutely. One of the things that concerns me is the very generous paid parental leave scheme he's got. You look at it, he's implementing a new tax to pay for it, and it's maybe 3 or 4 times the size of the current scheme. I don't see, given the trying to pay down the debt, cut taxes, then on the other hand they're raising taxes and have this massive spending program as well. I don't see how that gels into a coherent policy framework.
Ed, when you finish text messaging, what's your response?
I was text messaging someone to help get me out of here. Actually, is your next program format that you'll actually put your guests in a cage and you'll poke them with a stick? Because I
Chain him to the desk when we take a commercial break. In fact, we'll do that right now. We don't have to listen to this. We'll take a commercial break. We'll let Ed get his cage fantasy off the table during the break. We'll be back in a moment.